Okay. Probably what I want to talk to you about, Steve, today, if I can, is the leadership journey that startup entrepreneurs go on from start to finish. So from Series A all the way to the end.
Yeah, all the way to the end.
All the way to the end. Well, until they decide to IPO or
trade sale or whatever it is.
Yeah, go south of the Mediterranean or whatever.
Yeah,
happens from there. When at the start of that process, how does a founder go about dealing with some of the leadership issues that they've got to deal with?
I guess if you go to the very, very beginning, the leadership journey for a founder there is to get other people to believe in their dream, right? Because typically, even if it's one or two people, or potentially even three, right? They have an idea. It's their idea. They're quite fixed on that idea. And to execute on that, they can start. But then to go past a certain level of any kind of growth, they're going to need to hire other people in some form. They're going to need to get funding. They're going to need to get customers. They're going to have to do something. And that's probably the first part of leadership, is how do they lead everybody into believing that what they're doing is going to solve everyone's problems and be the right thing to do. And that's something that I think a lot of founders don't think about. I think they just genuinely believe, this is genius. I know what I'm trying to achieve here. I've got this vision. Everyone's just going to come along. They just are, because how could they not? And they don't realize that, that I don't think people even see that as leadership, but that is the actual very first seed of leadership, is actually leading other people along the dream to even just start this process with them. And I think that's probably the hardest thing that most people don't consider when they're going into the startup space.
Do you find that because of that, when people are coming up with this idea and they perhaps are in the beginning they're their own sales team and all of that stuff, do you think that some of those foundational skills, as they're building up that business, they're going out and showing people, does that help in terms of developing their skills as they move into the latter stages?
It's really interesting. Someone actually asked me to align founders with dogs at some stage, which I haven't done yet, but there are certain types of founders, and I'll explain what I mean. So there's technical founders, there's sales-based founders, there's marketing-based founders, and there's sort of product-based founders, and occasionally there's finance-based founders, but that's very rare. Okay. So they all have a very different approach to everything. Obviously, a technical-based founder typically, and of course there's always exceptions, are very into the product and how they're going to build it, and typically are not great salespeople, not natural leaders. There are salespeople that usually are good initial leaders. And I'll clarify what I mean by that later, because salespeople don't always make great leaders later as the business grows. But at the beginning, they're great. Marketing leaders are almost similar to salespeople, and then product leaders are completely obsessed with the product, and again, are not typically great. So they all have to learn how to get everyone to come on their journey. That's a skill in itself, but I don't think that really helps them in terms of leadership with their people. So it depends how you're defining leadership. If we're defining leadership here as the journey someone's going to go on in terms of their business, then it probably doesn't really have, unfortunately, any bearing on that at all. And I'm a massive believer that anyone can learn to be a leader. I do believe that. I don't think everyone can learn to be a manager, but I do believe anyone can learn to be a leader, which is contrary to what a lot of people say, because I think leadership is just a way of thinking. It's a way of approaching how you go about your day-to-day life. And management is a skill, a little bit like sales or marketing or so forth. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yeah. Because I found that sometimes when people get those terms confused, like we have a program at Griffith that's about leadership and management.
Yeah.
And I remember the guy who set it up years ago, we had this huge conversation about the difference between the two. And I think it's a good point you make, because when management is something that's really task-oriented.
Yeah, completely.
And leadership is about building that vision and sharing that vision with people, and the skill set, I think, of transforming that vision into some kind of reality. I think
you're right. And management's a skill, right? It's a skill. Whereas leadership also changes. Like as we're about to sort of go through, leadership in the early stage is very different to the middle stage, is very different to the end stage. And as a leader, you actually have to learn new leadership skills as your business grows. So it's a continuous evolving process as opposed to something you're naturally good at. There are people that are naturally good at leaders at certain stages, but terrible leaders at other stages. So there's no such thing, in my belief, as just a natural born leader. It's something that you're continuously working on all the way through your career or the journey of the startup.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'll pick up on that for a second. As time progresses and as the startup begins to blossom, and so maybe you're attracting early investors at this point,
yep.
And you've gone past that seed stage, and now you have to build a team. So leadership is now becoming about working with a group of people, however big or small.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges leadership challenges that some of the startup founders will have at this stage?
So yeah, at this stage, there's a very typical type of person that's going to work in your business, and it's someone who loves ambiguity, who loves to get involved in everything, who doesn't need specifics. What you're selling there as a leader is you're selling the dream, like the dream. This is what we're going to do. This is the problem we're going to solve. These are the people we're going to help. This is why we're building that. So in that level, I think it's really about storytelling, the leadership skills that you require at that level. You need to be able to convey your story to sometimes investors, but very much your staff. And they need to come on and actually believe that what you're trying to do from a story perspective is going to benefit the world in whatever way. Because it's a really, really difficult phase. There is no defined job. It doesn't matter whether you come in as head of marketing, head of sales, or head of finance. You're going to be doing all sorts of different things. Your role is going to continuously change. You're going to be working hours that are probably unreasonable, and you're probably going to be underpaid. So if you can't sell your story and get people to believe in your dream and it become their dream, and it has to become their dream as well, or they won't stay, because the conditions, as we just described, are pretty awful, like low pay, long hours, right? That's the skill you need as a leader at that really early stage. It's that storytelling, that real, camaraderie kind of building. It's probably what leadership's more portrayed as in movies and things like that. It's that kind of, we're all in it together kind of thing. It's like sitting around the campfire trying to get to the end of the trail, or survival. It's survival to some degree. So I think that's the definition of leadership there. And if you're not naturally good at that, and you get a lot of technical founders and product founders who aren't necessarily good at that because they're passionate about the specifics within, they have to learn how to do that. And it's actually not that hard to do. We've worked with quite a few on just helping them being able to articulate their story well enough. And if they're passionate about it from a technical point or product point, it doesn't matter. The passion will come through. It's just how they articulate that. And every leader is going to be different, of course, as we talked about. But yeah, it's really storytelling at that stage.
So I think as that time progresses, the storytelling, the leadership narrative, the vision that people buy into, just out of interest, how does one motivate and sustain those people during the difficult time as the next stage of growth comes along? How do you keep those people motivated?
So, good question. And some of those people you actually won't want as you progress through. And I think this is something that founders particularly need to understand. Being a good leader doesn't mean that everyone that you get along the journey at the beginning is going to be there at the end. In fact, most of them won't. There'll actually only be a few that will be able to go on that journey all the way along. And being a good leader is making sure you understand that and making sure they also understand that. So I think the key thing about that is, and this is where you can use equity and shares and sorts of things like that to motivate people that will not be with you later in the journey because it doesn't make any logical sense, but they'll still get their payout at the end of the sale or the IPO, whatever it is. So there are people that you'll hire that are what you would call early stage specialists, and leading them, as we talked about, is that storytelling. And then as it gets harder and it gets sort of a bit more difficult and it gets more specific, your leadership skills have to sort of switch to less about this is the dream and off we go and we're trying to save the world, to okay, now I need you guys to sort of come back down to reality. This is the budget we have. This is the timelines we have. Because what you'll see sometimes with people who are constantly saying the dream is that they're leading their staff to try and create this perfect product or this utopia that isn't a reality. If you're going to take your business successfully through the journey, you have to be willing to go out to market with what is just good enough. And then you have to be willing to take that what's good enough to your customers and say, do you actually like that? Because the reality is, whatever your dream and your staff's dream are, might not be what your customer wants. And your dream may have to change. So that's a very difficult thing when all of your staff are completely fueled by this sort of vision in the sky, and then suddenly that's the wrong vision. That can really be destroying and can upset a lot of people within that business. So as a leader, you have to explain to them and say, look, we're trying to solve a problem for these people. Whatever they want, that's what we need to provide. It's not about what we want anymore. We need to sort of move away from that. And that's quite a hard thing to do as well. And it can be really damaging to people who have large egos to suddenly realize that what they decided was going to be the best thing is actually not right, or isn't, maybe not right, but not what people want. So it's taking them on the journey and helping them understand that they didn't get it wrong. They just hadn't got it right yet. And I think it's sort of almost managing people's emotions, that next stage, as they go through that transition. And you'll probably have the same staff during this period. I don't think you really get to changing your staff until it gets quite a bit bigger.
Right.
So it's really managing them and keeping them motivated and making sure that they understand this was always going to happen, or this is going to happen. And I think that's probably the key in leadership, is letting people know something's going to happen before it happens, not when. So you need to prepare them for the fact that everything that they've dreamt of is probably not right, and we're going to have to morph it to what our customers ultimately want.
That's interesting, because a lot of that, when you were talking then, what it made me think of was this idea of resilience, but also the problems that leaders have is this change coming in. So you talked about adapting to the customer's needs and changing the orientation of the business. I guess the challenge then as a leader is being open and transparent, discussing these things in a forum where people know what's happening and they have a clear understanding. Do you think during these phases, how important is it to maintain morale as this sort of adaptation happens to the industry, as this change happens? Do you think it's important to sort of keep that, as a leader, to keep that boat going forward, keeping the open and transparent levels of communication?
Yeah, I think you need to be ahead of it. So change is going to be continuous through the journey, and you need to be ahead of that change so that you can let your crew, your staff, your employees, however you want to sort of coin them, to let them know that the change is coming. Because where people feel uncomfortable is when surprises. Human beings generally don't love surprises, other than birthdays. They don't like feeling insecure, but they like excitement of change. Now, if change happens when you're not expecting it, it makes you feel insecure. If change happens because you know it's coming and you're working towards it, you still feel quite secure. The reality is you're not secure in either of those scenarios, but it's about how human beings feel. COVID was a great example, right? COVID, everyone felt really, really insecure in terms of what was going to happen, and the world was like panicked. The reality is all our lives are completely the same, whether COVID's here or not. We could all get killed tomorrow through any number of ways, but we feel secure. So it's not about whether you are or aren't secure, and I think that's something that's really important that you must recognize as a leader. Nothing's secure, but it's about making people feel like that. And when change is coming, if you can keep ahead of it, you can keep the boat moving towards change, as opposed to change has happened, now we've got to react. Right. So it's about them seeing it coming as opposed to having to react to it. Now, you're not always going to be able to do that. And when you don't, and things do hit you, and they will because it's a startup, managing that feeling of insecurity or that feeling of change is where you have to really step in as a leader. And I think, as you talked about morale, yes and no. Like, you don't want to be creating false morale. You don't want to be telling them everything's all right and you've only got 3 days left of runway. You know, there has to be a real balance between openness and reality and what's actually happening. That doesn't mean they need to know everything, but they need to know most of it, particularly in a startup, I feel. I mean, we're not talking large corporates who hide everything and no one knows anything, goodness heaven forbid. And like I said, they don't need to necessarily know that you're feeling completely insecure and you're panicked. They need to see you looking as confident as possible. But at the same time, they want to see a little bit of vulnerability as well. It's a really difficult, leadership's awful. It's the hardest thing in the world.
Yeah, it is, for sure. On some of the things that I've been researching, actually, I spent quite a bit of my career looking into complex problem solving, and the one thing that they forgot to mention in that is how difficult it is to be vulnerable during massive periods of change, and how you yourself sometimes as a leader, you're guiding people through this storm, and like you said, you're slightly ahead of these cycles of change as they're happening, but then you've got to also remember the people that are watching you have to make sure that they have confidence in what's happening, but also understand that it's a bit of a balancing act about developing a sense of stability in a very unstable situation.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think you can appear vulnerable and upset and shocked, but you know where to go.
Yeah.
That's what they want. They don't necessarily want someone that doesn't get fazed by anything and powers through the old traditional. They want someone that genuinely they can see, okay, well, it's affecting them as well, but they also want to know that you've got a plan. And I think that's the key thing, as opposed to if you sit there and go, guys, I've got no idea what to do. That's not great leadership.
No.
That will probably happen at some stage, right? And it probably will. And if any founder who says it hasn't happened to them is lying, and we all make that mistake. But I think most of the time they want to know that at least you've got a plan or an idea or someone to talk to, or you've got something you're going to do that is going to help them get through, as you said, the storm, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because what I'm thinking of at the moment is as you get through to those next stages, so now you've survived this turbulence, you're building a huge team, so maybe you've got 15 or 20 teams now. Maybe you're looking at the exit. What goes through a leader's mind when you've got that kind of infrastructure to deal with?
So it's really, I think that there's a lot of myths around this. So the phase we've just described, I think most people would assume is the hardest phase. But it's just not at all. Right. The hardest phase is what everyone thinks is the easiest phase, which is that phase when you've had success and you've scaled, and now you're going, okay, well, we've got to X amount of size, we've got a proven product, we've got a customer base, we've got happy investors. Now everyone wants the magical exit. One, it's always a lot further away than you think in terms of years, because it just takes forever to exit things properly. But two, it's like, okay, well, what's your role in that exit, and how can you suddenly take a business that has relied on you as a leader to no longer rely on you as a leader? Otherwise, how are you going to exit? So if a business is to be a proper business, it doesn't need a single leader. It doesn't need, as in a founder leading it. It needs a corporate structure. It needs a C-level, CEO, CFO, CEO. They need to become the leader and the leadership team. And they need to be operating from less of an emotional kind of dreamscape that founders do, and in just more, okay, well, this is business, and we're just going to execute a business, and this is how we see it. It's not their baby, it's a business. Now, that, as a founder, is the hardest leadership change, is one, during that time, you're going to have to let go some of those people that have taken you all the way through that storm, and you've just been through, let's arguably hell together, right, to some degree. Hell and heaven at the same time, right? It's up and down, champagne and razor blades, all those sayings. So you've been through that with these people, and you feel great affinity to them. But you're now getting to a point where roles become really specific and really granular, and those people that you've got that can cope with anything and are great with ambiguity, they're useless to you. In fact, they're a hindrance to you because they won't get out of everybody else's businesses, and now you need to go granular. They have to be either moved into some other area, and it could be a new product, it could be a new market. There are options, but usually more than anything they probably need to go and leave and go and do another early stage startup, because that's what they're great at, and like we talked about earlier, that's where ESOP can come in and make sure they get rewarded, and that's something they need to think about much earlier. So again, if you have that conversation with them early enough, that's great. If you suddenly go, you know what, John, I'm sorry, but you're annoying everyone and you're in everything, so we're going to just have to let you go and replace you with these three people, that's going to be a horrific experience for you, and it's going to be gut-wrenching, and it's going to be awful for them. So again, that leadership is, again, being ahead and saying, look, as we go into this phase, guys, we're going to have to find new roles for you, or we're all just going to have to work out how we're going to move out of this business. But we've all got our equity, so it's okay. And we're going to work out how we replace ourselves to take it to that next phase. And that's a very difficult thing to do. Not just for the staff that you've gone through battle with, but for yourself. There aren't many founders that can go the whole journey. They do exist, there's no question. But there aren't many. Most will have to get out the way of themselves to get the exit that they really want. They can exit earlier, but most want to have the really big exit. It's kind of why you do it to some degree. So if they want that, they're going to actually have to get... Now, that could mean they move into a chairman role, an ambassador role, even out of the business, and replace themselves. And that's what leadership is. It's being able to understand and recognize where your shortcomings are and where you need to get out of the way, and also making sure that your team understand that change that's coming and helping them go through that. And all of you together leading the next generation of corporate people to some degree who are going to take it to that next level. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yeah. I think one of the things that you said there, which I thought was interesting, which I think is absent in the leadership literature, is the emotional journey you have to take people on as something grows, and how there's this time and place where people will need to move on. And something I've heard you just say then that I don't think I've heard from too many other people was you have to prepare people for that exit. You have to prepare people to leave. And I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it, because as I look around like the place where I work, you can see some people, they've never had that conversation, but maybe 5, 6, 7 months or years ago, someone should have said to them, listen, mate, you've got to move on now. Like, we're going in this direction, you're going in that direction. We can help you.
Well, I'll give you a good example. Look at Atlassian. So, those guys are still very much involved in that business, but they've also got a lot of other things that they're doing outside of that business, and they have a corporate structure. That business went through massive growth and continues to succeed. But if you look at all the people that were there during the battle years, none of them are there, but they all have their equity, or unless they've sold it. But, they prepared them. And I think leadership is being able to prepare people for what's coming. That's what leadership is, and it is the emotional side that's the hardest thing in startup world, because it's a very emotional experience being in a startup. You know, it connects to your soul, it connects to your whole being, because it takes so much to actually make something like that work.
Yeah.
And there's a sense of almost grieving and loss when you leave a business. So I've exited 2 businesses, and I can tell you there is definitely a sense of grieving, particularly if you've been with someone a long period of time. So I had a founder who I'd been with an enormous amount of time, and I didn't recognize it until I actually lost a parent a few years later. But when I left, I felt awful in so many different ways. And there was a grieving process you go through, and I don't think people even talk about that. And obviously it's not the same as grieving a death, but it's the same mental anguish that you kind of go through. And if you're not prepared for it, it catches up with you. It's the same as a sports star who suddenly doesn't train or compete anymore. It's this huge sense of purpose and loss that they had is gone. And it's the same for the people that have been on that journey. But if you prepare everyone, then that transition is not necessarily easy, but it's easier, it's more comfortable, and it will be far better for the business in terms of it heading towards whatever exit it is that you're taking it to.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it also there's some interesting balances there, but relationships between that and some of the perhaps less startup foundery type people that I've talked to, and I think it really taps into that managing the team and managing the expectations of the team, but also thinking more, which is where I see leadership going at the moment, into this sort of open territory where we're talking more about the realities of what it's really like and the experiences of exiting a business that perhaps you put your heart and soul into for over 10 years, maybe even longer.
Quite often longer. And I think, some of them will go on to be CEOs, right? And that's a really difficult transition. Yeah. Because the CEO role is nothing like a founder role. Everyone has CEO, founder as their titles, right? But they're very different roles. Founder is a doer. They are driving change and pushing forwards. A CEO is purely an enabler and almost an ambassador role. So your job is then to enable everyone else. You're just really removing roadblocks. So they come to you with all the problems, and you help them remove those problems so that they can do their jobs. Whereas a founder is creating. So again, those people who make that transition, and it's a really difficult transition for them to make, because they have to change the way they work. And this is why many can't actually make that transition, or shouldn't make that transition. Some do, and we won't talk about the bad examples, but there's plenty of them. But that, being a CEO leader is very different to being a founder leader or being a manager leader. There's so many different types of leadership, and I think the problem is that you look at leadership programs that people do, they're one size fits all, which is madness.
Yeah,
because they're just not at all. And startups is completely different to everything else. And I can't really talk to leadership too much around corporates, because I left the corporate world 19 years ago, thank the Lord. So I'm really way out of my league when it comes to that. That was not a space for me. I'm not someone that can play that political game. And it is a political game, and I know people use that term, but when you think about it, you have stakeholders you have to appease, you have people, you have to think about all these other people before you do anything to make sure they're all going to be okay with it. Whereas a founder, you're sort of driving things. So they're very, very different worlds, and people don't appreciate that.
Yeah, they are very different, and I think a lot of the executives and especially I think even the terminology we use in some of those leadership programs, like executive education, the majority of businesses that I talk to, they are not corporate like that. They are run by a founder. Yep. They tend to have a small team, and they tend to want something that they can adapt and use, right? And it's interesting in some of the conversations I've had about how we tailor a lot of these things to this very small percentage of real businesses. Yeah. And I find that's quite a challenge. But is there anything else that you would say to a young person starting out in leadership today on the startup journey? What would be some of the ideas or tips you could, some of your wisdom?
I think, I'm getting to that age, aren't I? I think the understanding that leadership is completely a journey that will never stop. It's not unlike parenting. Leadership's great training for being a parent. That changes at every cycle of your children's age, just like the same thing with your business.
It's a challenge, though,
and how you lead in different stages, you need to think about that. But I think the key thing is, if you are in a leadership position and you want to be a good leader, you need to be ahead of everything. You need to always be looking and looking ahead rather than reacting. Because your job is to take everybody on that journey. That's what the leader's job is, and to make everyone feel good and comfortable about doing that as much as you can so that they can perform at their best. And you can only do that if you know what's coming before they do. So if you hear about things at the same time they do, you're a reactive leader. That's okay, there's going to be periods where you need to do that, but if you do that the whole time, you're going to have a whole bunch of staff or employees who look like guinea pigs. You know how guinea pigs always look terrified? You're going to have people like that. You don't want people like that. You want people who are sitting there calmly, like a goldfish, because if we're going to go down the animal route, just sitting there waiting, and they just execute because they feel comfortable that you know what's coming and you're going to be able to guide them through that. And I guess that would be the leader, that would be the traditional role of like a religious leader or something like that. It's the same sort of thing, guiding a flock. I think you need to think about that and make sure that you are changing yourself, and that at every year you need to look at how you've led and go, is that appropriate for the year that I see coming? Yes or no? Okay, well then I need to make sure that I'm changing myself to be prepared for that. So it's always looking forwards and changing yourself and knowing that what you're doing today won't be right tomorrow.
Okay.
It's brutal, isn't it?
Yeah, that is very brutal. You wonder why people put themselves through it, but I can understand why. Having talked to quite a few people, it's about passion really, and it's about the desire to achieve something which you think needs to be fixed.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think to be a good leader, you have to want to be a good leader. A lot of people don't want to be in leadership roles at all, and you kind of think they should be. But if they don't want to be, you shouldn't push them into it because, like we said, because they look like a good leader now, that doesn't mean they'll be a good leader in a different scenario. So leave them alone.